But what about us? Jane collapsed to the floor, sobbing. Why would you do this? Are you planning to live on the streets? That's the beauty of the law, Mr. Williams replied with a cold smile. The town of Reading, Pennsylvania was straining under the painful transformation of a new industrial era. Amid sprawling construction sites thick with dust and the thunderous roar of Caterpillar bulldozers, the house at 402 Oak Lane stood like a relic abandoned by time. It was a grand Victorian structure spanning over 2,500 square feet with a pitch-black slate roof, sitting isolated on a 3-acre lot shaded by towering old oak trees. On Monday morning, a sleek black Lexus screeched to a stop in front of the rotting wooden fence. Stepping out was Robert Sterling, a senior representative of Horizon Real Estate Group. He straightened his tie, clutched a thick folder of documents tightly under his arm, and strode quickly through weeds that rose past his knees. "Mrs. Martha, I know you're in there." Sterling pounded hard on the heavy oak door. "This is your last chance. Our corporation has agreed to raise the offer to $3.2 million. Do you hear me? $3.2 million for this pile of ruins." The only response was the creaking groan of wooden floorboards from inside. Losing patience, Sterling shouted through the crack in the door, "Listen carefully. The city council will meet on Thursday to vote on rezoning. If you don't sign before 5 p.m. Wednesday, that's exactly 72 hours from now, the city will trigger eminent domain. They'll flatten this place to build an access road to the highway, and you'll walk away with a lousy $200,000 compensation check. Do you understand? It's $3.2 million or nothing." The door opened a narrow slit, revealing a pair of clouded eyes behind thick prescription glasses. Martha, 78 years old, her white hair tangled and unkempt, whispered in a trembling voice, "Shh, Henry will be home for dinner soon. He hates strangers making noise. Don't sell his oak garden." With that, she slammed the door shut and bolted it. Furious, Sterling kicked the front step, cursed under his breath, and pulled out his phone. He didn't call his boss. He called another source. 50 miles away, inside a run-down apartment reeking of cigarette smoke, Betty's phone began vibrating violently. At the same time, at the elementary school where Jane, the younger daughter, was teaching, a message flashed on her Apple Watch. The message was short, but its impact was nuclear. Elderly mother refuses to sell. Final price $3.2 million. Deadline 72 hours. Eminent domain pending. Come home now. Betty's eyes lit up like headlights cutting through the night. Jane's hands trembled as she dropped her chalk, not out of fear, but out of excitement. One sister drowning in gambling debt, the other addicted to shopping, both rushed for their cars. Betty's beat-up pickup truck and Jane's financed sedan tore down Interstate 76. They sped toward the decaying wooden house like starving vultures that had just caught the scent of a corpse, with one single objective: force their senile mother to sign at any cost. The roar of a V8 engine shattered the grim silence of the oak garden. A bright red Ford Mustang convertible, the classic American symbol of success, screeched to a halt beside the moss-covered front steps. Betty stepped out, removing oversized sunglasses that nearly hid her face. She tossed her freshly bleached blonde hair, forcing the posture of a successful businesswoman returning from the West Coast. No one knew that to rent this car for 3 days, just to show off in front of her younger sister, Betty had burned the last $500 on her credit card. What filled her mind now wasn't love for her mother, but the snarling voice of Tony the shark, a loan shark in Las Vegas. "You've got 1 week left, Betty. I want $200,000 principal, or I take your legs." Betty pushed the door open and stepped inside. The stench of damp, rotting wood hit her nose, mixed with the smell of cheap canned chicken soup. In the kitchen, Jane stood beside an old fireplace dating back to the 1950s. The younger sister wore a small floral apron, her hair neatly tied up, looking gentle and self-sacrificing like a living saint. But beneath the apron of the dutiful daughter, the iPhone in Jane's jeans pocket was vibrating relentlessly. Ping, ping. More alerts from Chase Bank and American Express. Your account has exceeded the credit limit. Current outstanding balance, $85,000. Immediate payment required to avoid legal action. Betty bit her lip until it bled. In the trunk of her sedan were still stacks of unopened Louboutin shoeboxes and Hermes handbags, the narcotics of her uncontrollable online shopping addiction. If this house sale fell through, Jane wouldn't just lose her teaching job, she would be facing prison for financial fraud. "Oh, my dear Jane," Betty opened her arms wide, her voice shrill and syrupy, masking her inner panic. "You look exhausted. Taking care of Mom all by yourself these past few years must have been so hard, huh?" Jane subtly stepped back to avoid the hug heavy with cheap perfume, forcing a pale smile. "It's good that you're back, Betty. I thought business in Nevada was so busy you'd forgotten the way home to this run-down house." "Work has been overwhelming, but when I heard Mom was unwell, I dropped everything and flew back," Betty lied without blinking, her sharp eyes scanning the house as if appraising every antique. "Where is she?" Jane stirred the soup and replied flatly, "Sleeping. I just gave her medication. It's bad. She keeps insisting on waiting for Dad to come home for dinner." Betty curled her lips into a calculating half-smile, her heavily made-up face tightening. "Bad for her health," she said softly, "but it might be good for us right now. $3.2 million can't wait for a dead person to come back to life, little sister." The air inside the old kitchen, thick with the stench of damp decay, suddenly tightened to a breaking point when Betty pulled a thick stack of documents from her fake crocodile leather handbag. She slammed them onto the oak table with a dry thud, sending a thin layer of dust rising off the tablecloth. "What is this?" Jane asked, her eyes catching the bold letters on the cover page. "Durable power of attorney." "Our golden key," Betty replied coldly, all traces of earlier sweetness gone. "Listen, Jane, Horizon Corporation isn't stupid. Their lawyers will never accept a home sale signature from an old woman who's having conversations with ghosts. If Mom signs the sale contract directly, the court will void it for lack of mental capacity, and then we lose the entire $3.2 million. Betty pulled out a Mont Blanc fountain pen and tapped it rhythmically against the paper. "The only way is for Mom to sign this. It grants the appointed agent full authority to manage assets, sell property, withdraw bank funds on her behalf. And since I'm the eldest, I already filled in my name as primary agent." Jane snatched the document back, her once gentle eyes sharpening like razor blades. "Are you kidding me? You vanished for 5 years, no calls, no Christmas cards, and now you want life and death control over Mom's assets?" "I'm the only one here who understands business," Betty snapped, her aggressive nature fully exposed. "You're just a preschool teacher. What the hell do you know about negotiating a multi-million-dollar deal? I'll handle the sale. You just keep spoon-feeding Mom like you always do." "Not a chance," Jane scoffed, her voice trembling with rage but firm with resolve. "I'm the one who changed her diapers, who took her to doctor appointments every week. If anyone gets the authority to sign away this house, it should be me. Either my name goes down as primary agent, or I call Adult Protective Services right now and report you for attempting to defraud an elderly person." Betty froze. She stared at the meek younger sister she thought she knew. Jane's eyes held no fear, only a feral greed no less intense than her own. In that moment, Betty realized Jane was no longer a child she could bully. They both wanted control of the money flow because whoever held that piece of paper would be in charge when the funds hit the account. Fine, Betty lowered her voice, her eyes narrowing with calculation. But time isn't on our side, little sister. Mom's losing it, but she needs to be lucid for exactly 5 minutes to sign right here in front of witnesses. I don't care how you do it. Wake her up, now. The grandfather clock in the main hall struck 2 a.m. Outside, the wind howled through the old oak trees, sounding like the moans of starving spirits. The house was submerged in darkness, except for the weak yellow light spilling from the kitchen. Jane stood at the counter, her hands trembling as she held a bottle of alprazolam, a powerful sedative commonly prescribed for anxiety. She poured 2 blue pills onto a stainless steel spoon, then used the back of another spoon to crush them into a fine powder. The shrill metallic scraping echoed through the dead silence of the night. Jane poured the white powder into a mug of warm milk mixed with honey, Martha's familiar nightly drink. She needed her mother to sleep deeply, so deeply that clinical death wouldn't have bothered her, so Jane could tear apart the bedroom in search of the original deed, locked away in the safe. Without that document to confirm precise property lines for the lawyer in the morning, everything would stall. Clink! Jane jolted, nearly dropping the mug. Betty stood leaning against the doorframe, a red Marlboro cigarette dangling from her lips, her sharp eyes fixed on the scattered white powder. "You trying to kill the old woman?" Betty asked hoarsely, not in protest, but like she was evaluating the situation. I just want her to sleep well," Jane stammered, her face drained of color. "Lately she's been delirious, wandering around at night. It's dangerous." Betty stepped forward, stubbed the cigarette out in the sink with a hiss. Then she picked up the pill bottle, read the label, then sneered. 2 pills for a 78-year-old who weighs under 100 pounds? You're real filial, little sister. Then, unexpectedly, Betty didn't take the bottle. Instead, she unscrewed the cap and dropped 1 more pill into the milk. "Just a little extra to be safe," Betty said, casually, like seasoning soup. "I don't want her jumping up and screaming like a horror movie while we're cracking the safe. I need to find Dad's bank account information. Rumor has it the old man left some undisclosed trust fund." The sisters looked at each other. In that instant, the last moral masks collapsed. There was no villain or saint anymore, only 2 cold-blooded accomplices. They carried the special milk upstairs. Martha lay curled on the large bed, mumbling in her half-conscious sleep. Jane helped her sit up. Betty held the mug to her lips. "Drink up, Mom. Warm yourself and sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Martha obediently drank it all, unaware that the 2 daughters she had given birth to were injecting the poison of greed directly into her veins. Tuesday afternoon, the weak golden sunlight of the American Northeast washed over the backyard deck. To put on a show for the neighbors and soothe Martha before H-hour, the sisters decided to host a small BBQ. The smell of seared ribeye beef mixed with pungent ketchup sauce rose from the battered old gas grill. Martha sat at the head of the table, her frail body swallowed by an oversized hand-knit sweater. The lingering effects of last night's overdose left her mind foggy, her dull eyes staring into empty space. "Eat up, Mom," Jane said as she cut the sauce-soaked steak into small pieces on a ceramic plate, her hands sweet while her knife pressed down hard enough to make an ugly scraping sound. "It's good meat, $20 a pound." Betty sat across from her, swirling a glass of red wine, her eyes glued to her phone as she secretly texted her private lawyer. The tension at the table was tight as a drawn wire. Suddenly, Martha's body twitched. She turned and stared straight at Jane. In her delirium, suspended between reality and illusion, she didn't see her dutiful daughter. She saw a dark figure reaching into her pocket. "Thief!" Martha screamed, her voice hoarse but filled with hatred. Her thin arms swung violently, knocking the plate of steak flying. Crash! The plate shattered across the wooden floor. BBQ sauce-soaked meat splattered all over Jane's pristine white dress and sprayed across Betty's face. "You stole my letters! Give me back my pension money! Get out!" Martha pointed directly at Jane, her eyes blazing with fury. Jane went pale, not because of the ruined dress, but because her mother's words struck dead center. She feared that in her madness, Martha might blurt out financial secrets Jane had been hiding. Fear instantly turned into savage aggression. "You're crazy! Shut up!" Jane roared, throwing the knife onto the table. She lunged forward, grabbed Martha under the arms, and dragged her toward the back door. "Let me go! Help! Henry!" Martha screamed weakly. Jane shoved her mother into the ground floor bedroom, slammed the door shut, and locked it from the outside. Heavy pounding erupted from within. Outside, Betty wiped sauce from her cheek and slowly stood up. Instead of stopping her, she pulled out her phone, switched on video recording, and walked toward the locked door. "Jane, open the door right now, Jane. What the hell are you doing? Unlawful detention. I'm recording this. This is level 1 elder abuse. I'll call 911 and send you to prison unless you hand over the safe key right now." When Martha's crying from inside the bedroom finally faded, exhausted into silence, Jane returned to the living room, wiping sweat from her forehead with a paper towel. She tried to steady herself, preparing to explain her earlier violent outburst. But Betty was already seated in the worn leather armchair, legs crossed, an illuminated iPad resting on her lap. Without looking up at Jane, she exhaled a cloud of pale cigarette smoke and spoke casually. "I just got an email from Mike. You remember Mike, right? The private investigator in Philadelphia I used to sleep with." Jane froze, a wave of unease crashing over her. "You investigated me?" "Not exactly," Betty smirked. "I was just curious how a preschool teacher making $45,000 a year could maintain such a glamorous Instagram lifestyle and drive a BMW. And guess what Mike found?" She turned the iPad toward Jane. On the screen was a detailed Experian credit report under the name Martha Sterling, but the long list of debts belonged to unfamiliar accounts. 5 credit cards, Betty read aloud, her voice sharp with mockery. Amex Platinum, Chase Sapphire Reserve, Citi Prestige, all opened under Mom's Social Security number within the last 3 years. Total outstanding balance, completely maxed out at $120,000. Jane went numb, her knees buckled, and she grabbed the arm of the chair to keep from collapsing. "You committed identity theft against your own mother," Betty said, standing up and walking slowly toward her trembling sister. "You used her lifetime perfect credit score to finance handbags and designer shoes. And now that credit card interest rates hit 25%, you're drowning. You need to sell this house not to take care of Mom, but to pay off your debts before the banks sue you and throw you in prison. Am I right?" "Shut up! Shut up!" Jane screamed, tears streaming down her face, not from remorse, but from sheer terror. "What do you know? Do you have any idea how expensive it is to take care of her? I deserve that money." "I don't care what you deserve," Betty sneered, leaning in close. "I've got you by the throat now. This is a federal crime, little sister. If I forward this to the FBI, you'll rot in prison for at least 10 years. Jane collapsed onto the floor, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The angelic mask shattered completely, revealing a desperate, greedy creature backed into a corner. Jane's sobbing abruptly stopped.
She lifted her head, her tear-streaked face twisted into a crooked, unsettling smile, so unnatural that Betty instinctively took a step back. Jane rose slowly, brushed the dust from her knees, then reached into the pocket of her floral apron and pulled out a crumpled neon pink piece of paper, the distinctive color of urgent debt collection notices. "You really think you're the only hunter in this house, Betty?" Jane said flatly. "This fell out of your designer coat pocket when you bent down to hug me at the door. I got curious." Betty's face drained of color. She lunged forward to snatch it back, but Jane retreated quickly behind the kitchen table. Jane held the paper up and read aloud, each word hammering into the air. "Notice of repossession, addressed to Elizabeth Sterling. Your Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing in the Nevada court has been suspended due to evidence of fraudulent asset concealment. Furthermore," Jane paused, then locked eyes with her sister, "I also saw a threatening text on your phone while you were in the bathroom. Who is Tony Las Vegas? He says if you don't pay $200,000 by Friday, he'll send a gift straight to your funeral." Betty stood frozen. The hand holding her cigarette shook violently, ash scattering across the wooden floor. The wealthy businesswoman facade disintegrated completely, exposing a desperate gambler pushed to the edge. The rented Mustang was nothing more than camouflage, because loan sharks don't care about the law. "So," Jane stepped closer, the power dynamic fully reversed, "you need the money from this house even more than I do. If I go to prison for identity theft, Mom's assets will be frozen for years under investigation. Then what will you use to pay Tony? Your life?" Silence swallowed the room, broken only by wind whistling through a cracked window. The sisters stared at each other, breathing hard. No family, no morality, only raw survival instinct remained. Betty clenched her jaw, crushed the cigarette under her high heel. "Fine, you win. We're sitting in the same sinking boat." Jane curled her lip, eyes cold. "Then stop pretending to be loving sisters. We need a real plan to get the old woman's signature. Tonight." The sisters slipped into the back garage to avoid neighbors' eyes and their mother's muffled groans from the bedroom. Once Henry's sanctuary, the space now reeked of old gasoline and dust. A 1980 Ford F-150 pickup sat motionless under a torn tarp, a silent witness to the conspiracy about to unfold. Betty, perched on the hood, flicked her Zippo lighter and lit her third cigarette of the day. The bluish flame illuminated her anxiety-hollowed face. "Let's do the math," Betty exhaled. $3.2 million. After capital gains tax and brokerage fees, we walk away with around $2.2 million, split evenly $1.1 million each. Jane leaned against her father's old workbench, rubbing the hem of her sleeve. The number danced in her mind, enough to wipe out her debts, buy a luxury condo downtown, and start over. "And Mom?" Jane asked quietly. "Where does she go after the house is sold?" "I've already found a place," Betty said, pulling up a website for a facility called Sunset Haven. It's a low-tier, state-funded Medicaid nursing home in the next county. Facilities are run down, understaffed, smells like disinfectant, but most importantly, it's free once the patient has no assets. Jane shuddered. She knew places like that, where the elderly were left to rot, waiting to die alone. But what will people say? Jane worried about her image. "Who cares?" Betty scoffed, hopping off the hood and stepping closer. "We'll tell the neighbors we moved her to the best long-term care facility available. Once the money hits, I fly back to Vegas. You move somewhere else. You'll never have to see her again." Jane stared into the darkness of the garage, fighting her final internal battle. Her frail mother's image surfaced, then was immediately crushed by visions of court summons and prison bars. She lifted her head, eyes hardened. "Fine," Jane nodded sharply. 50-50, but you handle the lawyers. I don't want my name anywhere near legal paperwork if things go wrong." Betty smirked and extended a hand heavy with fake rings. "Deal. Remember this, Jane. Mom's lived her life. Now it's her turn to sacrifice so we can live." Their hands clasped tightly in the cold garage. A demonic alliance was sealed, slamming shut the last door of conscience in the Sterling family. Wednesday morning. Less than 24 hours remained before Horizon Corporation's deadline. The decaying wooden house was suddenly transformed into something strangely warm. Jane had been up since 5 a.m., scrubbing floors and placing fresh hydrangeas stolen from a neighbor's yard into a crystal vase on the living room table. The moldy odor was drowned out by thick lavender-scented candles. In the bedroom, the sisters were executing the most critical step, costuming their mother. Martha sat motionless on the edge of the bed like a torn rag doll. Jane carefully combed her mother's tangled white hair, tying it up to conceal faint bruises on the back of her neck, the aftermath of yesterday's struggle. Betty applied rose-pink lipstick to Martha's cracked, dry lips. "This color looks perfect on you, Mom," Betty praised sweetly, her eyes coldly scanning for any sign of resistance. "Today you're a queen. All you have to do is smile and nod, okay?" Martha blinked weakly. The sedative still lingered in her system, making her obedient in a terrifying way. She wore a navy blue silk dress, the finest dress she had ever owned, once worn at Jane's wedding 10 years ago, now hanging loosely on her skeletal frame. Ding dong! The doorbell rang. The sisters exchanged a look and took a deep breath. Showtime. Entering the house was Mr. Vance, Horizon Corporation's attorney, accompanied by a stern-faced notary public. Vance glanced at his gold Rolex. "Good morning, ladies. We don't have much time. I need to confirm that Mrs. Martha Sterling is fully lucid and voluntarily signing this power of attorney before we proceed with the land transfer." "Of course," Jane smiled, wearing the textbook gentle expression of an elementary school teacher. "My mother has been looking forward to this. She wants to use the money to travel Europe with her grandchildren." They wheeled Martha into the living room. Bright sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating the happy family scene. 2 devoted daughters standing on either side, their elegantly dressed elderly mother seated between them. A perfect picture. But Vance, with 20 years of experience as a real estate shark, smelled desperation and greed at a glance. He didn't care. His job was to secure the signature so the project could break ground. "Mrs. Martha," Vance placed the documents on the table. "Do you understand what you are about to sign?" Betty's hand tightened on her mother's shoulder, fingernails pressing lightly through the fabric, a silent warning. Martha looked up at Betty, then at Jane. In her clouded eyes flashed a moment of sheer terror, yet her lips moved exactly as rehearsed all morning. I understand." Attorney Vance pulled out his gold-plated Mont Blanc fountain pen, snapped off the cap with a decisive motion, and placed it into the bony, trembling hand of Mrs. Martha. "Here, ma'am, right above the line marked Principal," Vance said, pointing to the dotted line. The notary public sitting beside him already had the seal in hand, ready to press the raised stamp of authentication. The room fell completely silent. The ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like a countdown hammer. Mrs. Martha held the pen, but the tip hovered above the paper, shaking violently, leaving blurry streaks of ink suspended in the air. Inside her mind was a chaotic blur between hallucination and reality. She saw the house filled with memories, saw the oak garden, and saw the feral, hungry look in her 2 daughters' eyes. "Betty," hissed through clenched teeth. The smile on her lips had gone stiff, her eyes shooting out a clear threat. "Don't waste the lawyer's time." Mrs. Martha looked up, tears welling and spilling down her wrinkled cheeks. She turned to Jane, the youngest daughter she had once cherished the most. "Jane, you won't abandon me to a poorhouse, will you? You promise I can stay here, right?" Jane leaned forward, her left hand gently stroking her mother's shoulder, but under the table her right hand secretly slid down onto Mrs. Martha's thigh. Jane's long, sharp fingernails dug deep into the elderly woman's fragile flesh, squeezing hard with ruthless force. "Of course, my dear mother," Jane said sweetly, her voice syrupy while her eyes were icy cold. "We'll stay with you forever. Now sign it." The sharp pain shooting up from her thigh, combined with overwhelming terror and the side effects of the neurostimulant drugs, became the final straw. "Mrs. Martha!" let out a choked sob. "Henry!" The pen had just touched the paper, not yet forming the first stroke of a letter, when her hand suddenly stiffened. A crushing pain exploded in her chest like a sledgehammer slamming into her rib cage. Clack! The fountain pen slipped from her hand, rolling across the table as black ink spilled everywhere, soaking the crucial power of attorney document and turning it into a dark, useless mess. "Mom!" Betty screamed, not out of concern. She lunged forward, grabbing the ink-soaked paper, desperately trying to salvage it instead of catching her own mother. Mrs. Martha collapsed backward into her wheelchair, her body convulsing violently, foam spilling from her mouth. The entire room plunged into chaos. "Damn it, she's having a heart attack." Attorney Vance jumped to his feet, stepping back in fear of being dragged into legal trouble. "Call 911 now." But Jane and Betty stood frozen, staring at their mother's convulsing body. In their minds, there was no grief over losing their mother, only sheer panic at one realization. If she died right now, before the document was signed, the $3.2 million would vanish into a year-long inheritance battle. 3 minutes later, the wail of an ambulance siren ripped through the quiet streets of Reading. Red and blue emergency lights flashed wildly, sweeping across dusty windows and turning the living room into a grotesque dance floor. 2 burly paramedics stormed into the house with a stretcher and resuscitation gear. "Move aside! Everyone back!" one paramedic shouted when he saw Mrs. Martha lying purple-faced on the floor. They tore open the expensive blue silk blouse Betty had just dressed her mother in to attach heart monitor electrodes. "No pulse! Prep the defibrillator!" While strangers fought to wrestle Mrs. Martha's life back from death's grip, her 2 daughters were busy dealing with their own heart attacks named money. Betty grabbed the lapel of Attorney Vance's suit jacket just as he tried to leave to avoid trouble. "You stay right there," Betty screamed, her eyes bloodshot. "You saw it, didn't you? She was about to sign. That ink mark was her intention. You have to testify for me. This document is still legally valid, right?" Vance yanked his arm free, staring at Betty with a look of pure disgust rarely seen on the face of a pragmatic lawyer. He pointed at the ink-smeared paper on the table. "Are you insane? That's trash. She didn't write a single letter. If she dies before signing again, the $3.2 million deal is dead. Don't call me unless she wakes up and can hold a pen." With that, Vance strode out the door, leaving Betty standing there, frozen, clutching a worthless piece of paper. At the same time, in the corner of the room, Jane was kneeling beside her mother. "Step back, we need space to shock her," a paramedic barked. I just want to hold my mother's hand one last time," Jane sobbed, bowing her head low. But beneath the stretcher, Jane's hand was not holding her mother's hand. She was reaching into the pocket of Mrs. Martha's silk dress, rummaging frantically. She knew her mother always hid the safe key, where the original property deeds and jewelry were kept, inside a secret pocket sewn into the dress. Jane's fingers touched cold metal. She quickly pulled out the tiny brass key, stuffed it into her jeans pocket, then pretended to stand up and step back, her face contorted with extreme grief. "Charging, clear, shock!" Mrs. Martha's body jolted violently. The The two sisters locked eyes through the flashing ambulance lights. In their eyes, there was no prayer for their mother to live. There was only one desperate thought. Don't die. The old woman must not die. She had to live at least 1 more hour, long enough to sign that damned paper. The stretcher was rushed out to the ambulance. The two sisters followed close behind, not out of love, but to make sure their assets didn't slip out of their grasp. The intensive care unit at St. Joseph's Hospital was drowned in the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the bone-deep chill of the air conditioning system. Hour 71. Only 1 hour remained before Horizon Corporation's deadline. Betty and Jane paced restlessly in the hallway, not because they were worried about their mother, but because Attorney Vance had texted them, "No signature before 5 p.m., the $3.2 million deal is canceled. Good luck with the city's cheap compensation." The ICU doors swung open. The chief physician stepped out, his expression grave. "Mrs. Martha has temporarily stabilized. However, her aorta is severely blocked. We need to perform an emergency stent surgery immediately to sustain her life. The estimated cost is about $100,000, and her basic Medicare plan does not cover this procedure. The family must sign a financial commitment before we proceed." The two sisters exchanged a look. A wordless conversation flashed between them, brief, brutal, and calculating. $100,000 was a massive sum. If Mrs. Martha died right now, they wouldn't be able to sell the house at a high price, but they would still be the sole legal heirs to the land, even if its value was lower. That was still better than spending money to save her life, only for her to change her mind and refuse to sell the house. "Doctor," Betty spoke up, forcing a choked tone as she daubed dry eyes with a handkerchief, "our mother has suffered enough. She always said she wanted to pass peacefully to reunite with our father. We've decided not to proceed with the surgery." Jane nodded in agreement, gripping her sister's hand tightly. "That's right. Please let her go. Don't make her suffer any more. DNR. Do not resuscitate." The doctor looked at the two well-dressed women calmly bargaining with their own mother's life. He shook his head in disgust and turned to go back inside. "Wait!" A commanding voice echoed from the end of the hallway. Walking toward them was Mr. Williams, the family's longtime private attorney, whom the sisters believed had retired years ago. Beside him stood the town sheriff, his handgun holstered at his side, his expression stern and unyielding. "What the hell are you doing here?" Betty snapped. Mr. Williams didn't answer. He walked straight to the large TV screen mounted on the waiting room wall, pulled out a USB drive, and plugged it in. "I'm here at the invitation of my client, and before you decide who lives and who dies, I suggest you watch this." The screen lit up. It was footage from a high-angle view of Mrs. Martha's living room, recorded by a hidden security camera concealed inside the eye of an old teddy bear on the bookshelf. The black and white images were terrifyingly clear. Jane secretly pouring an overdose of medication into the milk, Betty smirking while plotting to dump their mother into a cheap nursing home, Jane pinching her mother under the dining table, and most damning of all, the recorded conversation. "She's lived long enough. Now it's time she lives for us." The sisters froze. The blood in their veins seemed to turn to ice. The sheriff stepped forward, one hand resting on his holster, blocking any escape. At that moment, the ICU doors behind them suddenly burst open. Mrs. Martha, the woman they had just refused to save, rolled herself out in a wheelchair. She had removed the oxygen tube. Her face was rosy, her eyes sharp and clear, showing not the slightest sign of dementia or a dying heart. The heart attack had been an act. She had been fully conscious the entire time and had seen everything. "Mom?" Jane stammered, her legs trembling as she stumbled backward. Mrs. Martha looked at her daughters with sorrowful yet resolute eyes. "I don't need surgery because my heart isn't sick. It's only been shattered by the 2 demons I gave birth to." "You've lost your mind," Betty screamed, shattering the stunned silence of the hospital hallway. She lunged toward the wheelchair. "Whether you were pretending or not, you still haven't signed the house sale. Under Pennsylvania inheritance law, when you die, that property belongs to us. We are your only heirs." Attorney Williams stepped in front of Betty, calmly pulling a thick stack of documents stamped with bright red notarization seals from his leather briefcase. "Miss Betty, you're correct about inheritance law," he said evenly, "but you're wrong about one fundamental thing. That property no longer belongs to Mrs. Martha." He raised the document for everyone to see. The bold title read, "Quitclaim Deed with Retained Life Estate." "Yesterday morning," Mr. Williams declared firmly, "before you even made it back home, Mrs. Martha signed over the entire property at 402. "Signed it over to whom? Horizon Corporation?" Jane asked shakily, clinging to a last shred of hope for commission money. "No," Mrs. Martha answered herself, her voice eerily calm. "I sold it to the Pennsylvania State Orphan Children's Charity." "For how much?" Betty shrieked, eyes blazing. Attorney Williams flipped to the final page and pointed at the line marked "Consideration, $1, $1. Betty and Jane looked as if they'd been struck by lightning. Their eyes bulged, locked on the lonely $1 printed on the page. 3.2 million vanished in an instant. "But what about us?" Jane collapsed to the floor, sobbing. "Why would you do this? Are you planning to live on the streets?" "That's the beauty of the law," Mr. Williams replied with a cold smile. "The life estate clause allows Mrs. Martha to live in that house until her final breath. No one can force her out. And Horizon Corporation, they've agreed to purchase the land from the charity for $3.5 million to build a community park and school named Henry and Martha Park after her passing. The money will go directly into the orphan fund. As for you two, you won't receive a single cent." The sheriff stepped forward. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed chillingly through the hall as he locked them onto Jane's wrists. "Jane Sterling, you are under arrest for identity theft, wire fraud, and elder abuse. We have sufficient evidence from bank records and surveillance footage." Jane screamed and sobbed as she was dragged down the stark white hallway. Betty wasn't arrested, but her fate was even more miserable. Her phone began vibrating nonstop. The screen flashed a name, Tony Las Vegas. She knew instantly, without an inheritance, she was already a dead woman. Betty slid down onto the cold hospital floor, her eyes hollow, staring into nothingness. Mrs. Martha gestured for her lawyer to wheel her toward the large glass window at the end of the hall. Outside, the autumn wind swept away the last blazing red oak leaves. She didn't look back at her daughters one final time. She looked at her own reflection in the glass and whispered, "I spent my whole life saving every acorn to build a nest for my children, but I forgot to teach them how to become decent trees. Today, I burn that nest down, hoping the fire will be enough to warm what remains of their conscience, in prison or in whatever life they have left."